ख़वातीन हज़रात अस्सलाम वालेकुम। मेरा नाम अली हबीब है और मैं आपको HBL Inspire पॉडकास्ट पे खुशामदीद कहता हूँ। हमारे आज के इस एडिशन का उन्वान है ग्लोबल मार्केट्स आउटलुक एंड लोकल इम्पैक्ट। ख़वातीन हज़रात, गुज़श्ता 2 साल से बहुत ही वॉलेटाइल और बहुत ही अनसर्टन ग्लोबल एनवायरनमेंट हो चुका है। कभी वो इश्यूज़ पॉलिटिकल इश्यूज़ हैं, कहीं जंग हो रही है, उसकी वजह से इंपोर्ट और उसके ग्लोबल सप्लाई चेन मुतासर हो रही है, कहीं क्लाइमेटिक इश्यूज़ आ रहे हैं। इन तमाम चीज़ों का असर पाकिस्तान में भी पड़ रहा है, क्योंकि पाकिस्तान बज़ाते ख़ुद एक इंपोर्ट ड्रिवन इकॉनमी है। हमारी दरामदात की इसमें काफ़ी अहमियत है हमारी इकॉनमी में, तो उसका इम्पैक्ट पाकिस्तान पर भी आ रहा है। जहाँ तक और ऊपर से ये बात भी चल रही है कि पाकिस्तान की अपनी इकॉनमी भी एक काफ़ी मुश्किलात का दो चार रही है। कोई कहीं इन्फ्लेशन की बात हो रही है, कहीं IMF लोन्स की बात हो रही है, कहीं प्राइवेटाइजेशन ऑफ स्टेट एंटिटीज़ की बात हो रही है, वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह। इन तमाम चीज़ों पे रोशनी डालने के लिए आज हमने मदऊ किया है अपने स्टूडियोज़ में रिशा मोहिउद्दीन को। रिशा हमारे ग्लोबल ट्रेज़रर हैं, HBL के ग्लोबल ट्रेज़रर हैं, वसी तजुर्बा रखते हैं। HBL के अलावा और बड़े इंस्टीट्यूशन में भी काम किया है, पाकिस्तान में भी, पाकिस्तान से बाहर भी। और इनसे आज हम पूछेंगे कि ये जो ग्लोबल चैलेंजेस, ये जो ग्लोबल मार्केट्स आउटलुक है, जो कि आज हमारा टॉपिक भी है, इसका पाकिस्तान की इकॉनमी पे क्या इम्पैक्ट है और इसका क्या किया जा सकता है, हाउ टू नेविगेट थ्रू दी चैलेंजेस दैट वी हैव। रिशा, थैंक यू फॉर जॉइनिंग अस, वेलकम। रिशा, बहुत सालों से सुनते चले आ रहे हैं कि जियोपॉलिटिक्स का पाकिस्तान पे बड़ा इम्पैक्ट पड़ता है। अब जियोपॉलिटिक्स है, इम्पॉर्टेंट है, या अब जियोपॉलिटिक्स अब रिप्लेस हो गई है जियो इकोनॉमिक्स से? क्योंकि ज़्यादा जिस चीज़ की बात करो उसका इवेंचुअली इम्पैक्ट जो है इकोनॉमिक्स पे आता है। सो इज इट जियोपॉलिटिक्स और इज इट जियो इकोनॉमिक्स दैट वी हैव टू बी अवेयर ऑफ?
Okay, thank you, Ali. So, look, I think the most important thing to visualize is that geopolitics and geoeconomics are closely intertwined. In fact, if you look at the last 30 years, it was dominated by economic changes, by globalization, by the neoliberal agenda. That's changed now. It's no exaggeration to say that the next 30 years will be dominated by politics and its impact on economies. The biggest shift we're seeing is that there are two blocks being formed, one the West and one the East. And very much there's, you could say, an economic Cold War between the US and China, which has extreme impacts on the rest of the world, especially Pakistan.
आपने अभी ऋषा इकोनॉमिक कोल्ड वॉर की बात की थी, कुड यू एक्सप्लेन दैट अ लिटिल? और आपने ये भी कहा था बीच में कि मुख्तलिफ ब्लॉक्स बन रहे हैं। सो जस्ट एक्सप्लेन दैट टू फॉर आवर ऑडियंस, ये इकोनॉमिक कोल्ड वॉर क्या है एंड व्हाट आर द टू ब्लॉक्स दैट यू टॉकिंग अबाउट?
So let me go back a little bit in history, back to the 70s and 80s. At the time, the US needed offshore suppliers because their cost base was rising. And they were very happy for China to come in and supply them cheaper goods, which they could use for their various, productive uses, for consumption, and so on and so forth. Now, that strategy proved to be really successful. China, as we know, is now the manufacturing hub for the world. They have 30% of global manufacturing capacity. Now, it's got to the stage where there's protectionism in the US because people in the US have been losing their jobs. A lot of products are now made in China rather than the US. So now there's a big move to have onshoring, that American companies should be producing in the US rather than offshoring from China. Now, you must have heard recently that they imposed 100% duty on Chinese EVs, electrical vehicles. Similar on microchips and other high-tech goods. So the countries now, such as the US, which are trying to protect their own industries, they're trying to develop into that space. And they don't want that business to be taken away by China and other world markets. So there's a clear-cut move now towards protectionism, towards making sure that countries are producing in-house, especially the strategic priorities. So that is what I mean by a Cold War, and that is what I mean by the politics is now taking over, because there's also a political war between two great powers.
Okay. लेकिन while we are staying on the global front, globally when we'll just park this discussion on the economic two blocks coming up. Globally इस वक्त दो तीन चीज़ें ऐसी हैं जिसका हर बंदा बात कर रहा होता है, and those are the war in Ukraine, the unrest in the Middle East, and the elections, the US elections coming up later in the year. When you combine these three variables, do you see an impact of them on the global economic situation? And especially, how does that volatility, if you want to call it, because it's a volatile situation, how does that volatility affect Pakistan in the local Pakistani context?
ओके तो जब ये यूक्रेन वॉर शुरू हुई है आज से कोई 2.25 साल पहले, उसका इम्पैक्ट अगले 2-3 महीने तक आ गया था. So you saw that commodity prices went up, wheat prices went through the roof. Ukraine and Russia accounted for 30% of global wheat exports. Russia, as we know, is a huge oil exporter. So that impact was felt very strongly in countries like Pakistan. And the indicator of that is our Eurobond yields, which are traded internationally, and it's an indication of the risk appetite people have on Pakistan. Those yields went up to 40-50%. In other words, people buying those...
From they went up to what were the yields like before this thing
Okay,
happened?
good question. So they were 7-8% annually before the conflict started. Very soon afterwards, the yields went up to 40-50% annually, annualized rates.
So we went from something like 7
right.
to 40.
Yes, 40, 50, in some cases 60%.
All right, okay.
So 60, 50, 60% a year, if your yield is you're getting that, obviously that means that people don't want to buy those instruments, right?
Okay.
So we felt that very strongly in places like Pakistan and Egypt and other countries. Basically, after that conflict started, global investors pulled money off the table. And that risk appetite is very important for countries like Pakistan. We need not just to issue bonds, but we need our LCs confirmed. We need funding from Middle Eastern banks, from global banks, Chinese banks, and so on and so forth. So we need that risk appetite, that confidence that Pakistan is a stable source of business. We need that to be maintained. And whenever there's a big conflict like that, it impacts risk appetite.
ये बात कहाँ तक सही है? There are a lot of people say that Pakistan is not well integrated into the global economy. तो इसलिए global economy के जो shocks आते हैं वो पाकिस्तान को इतना severely impact नहीं करते. Is that a right statement, or no, that statement is not correct?
It's right to some extent. I think the Ukraine conflict did have a big impact, but generally we are not as impacted as some other countries. Look, our imports are only around $55 billion a year.
Yeah.
You know, you look at countries like Vietnam, you look at countries like Indonesia, their imports are many times that, double, 3 times, 4 times that.
Yeah.
Why? Because they import capital goods, raw materials, they finish them, develop them, and export them.
Okay.
So, but their exports are also 4 or 5 times higher than us.
Okay.
So that's what you're absolutely right. We are not integrated enough in the global supply chains, in terms of trade and in terms of investment flows, compared to other countries which have developed much more rapidly compared to us.
Okay. A lot of Pakistanis work in the Middle East. Middle East is also a source of investment into Pakistan. We're an oil-dependent country. We import all our oil from there. Does this current unrest in the Middle East, which doesn't show any sign of abating for the time being, how does that impact Pakistan in the immediate term?
Well, you know, for the past few months, it has not really had a major impact. You look
Okay.
at oil prices; they went up slightly, they've come down again. You know, trading around $80 a barrel. That was around the ballpark where they were trading beforehand as well. In terms of risk appetite and investment flows, it's not really had a major impact. So far, at least economically, obviously it's a huge humanitarian crisis, but in terms of geoeconomics, even regional economics, it has not had a major impact.
Okay. Pakistan, आपने 2 economic blocks की बात की है. Pakistan seems to be, how does Pakistan navigate that?
Right.
Because one economic bloc is right next door to us. It's investing, it has major investments in Pakistan in the shape of CPEC, आपने चाइना की बात की, इकोनॉमिक ब्लॉक की बात की, दूसरा आप वेस्ट की इकोनॉमिक ब्लॉक बात कर रहे हैं जिसको US लीड कर रहा है, एंड अ लॉट ऑफ दीज multilateral agencies are based out of the US. US has influence on them. IMF की हम बात करते हैं, आजकल मेरे ख्याल में पाकिस्तान में बच्चा IMF के नाम से वाकिफ़ हो गया है. So how does Pakistan navigate this route between these two blocks,
Right.
which is one is right next door to us and hugely invested in Pakistan, and the others as well invested in Pakistan,
Right.
if not directly, then through these multilateral institutions like the IMF.
Right. So while you're seeing polarization between, say, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, there's still many countries around the world which don't have to formally join any bloc. We're not part of any military alliance. We're not part of any sort of deep-rooted economic alliance. So what we can do in this environment is be what you might call a connector economy. We can connect goods coming in from China into the US, for example, or from other countries into Europe. That production base, that manufacturing base needs to be developed because we're too small to have to take sides. I mean, our economy is 300 billion US. There's economies far bigger than us. I mean, India is over $2 trillion. Many countries are double, triple. Even Egypt has a much larger economy than us. I don't think either of the blocs expect us to be aligned totally with one side or the other. So I think what we need to do is be practical, provide these countries with a solid investment base where they're comfortable and confident in investing here, and developing our economic infrastructure. And that we can do without formally joining any of these two.
Okay. Now, while we're staying on this topic, और तो आपकी बात से लग रहा है कि ये कहना कि पाकिस्तान ग्लोबल शॉक्स, लेकिन कि पाकिस्तान जो है वो इतना इंटीग्रेटेड नहीं है ग्लोबल इकॉनमी में, एक हद तक के सही है उसके, लेकिन ये कहना कि साहब शॉक्स वो पाकिस्तान को भी लगेंगे आके, और लग रहे हैं. ग्लोबल शॉक्स की बात कर रहे हैं तो अब हम डेट पे आ जाते हैं. पाकिस्तान के ऊपर एक डेट बर्डन है. इन ग्लोबल शॉक्स का इन पाकिस्तान की डेट वल्नरेबिलिटी के ऊपर क्या इम्पैक्ट आ रहा है? लोग कभी-कभी, और ये जो हम कभी-कभी हम बात सुनने में आता है जो कि बहुत ही people talk about that very casually without really realizing the word default. What does a default word mean? And does that have to do anything with our debt burden?
Right. So debt sustainability is now a global issue. If you look at the total amount of debt in the world, it'll shock you. The total amount of debt now globally is 350 trillion US dollars.
Okay. And
global GDP is only around $100 trillion. So for every $100, there has to be $350 of debt. In other words, for every $100 of GDP that's generated,
okay,
there's $350 backing and pushing and generating that
okay,
GDP.
Okay.
That used to be 50, 60 years ago, $120, $130. So it's gone up by factors of 2.5, 3, 4 times.
Okay.
In the past few years.
Okay.
So this is now becoming an issue where even now in the US, they're saying that debt sustainability is going to be a problem down the road. So all countries have to be wary of just issuing too much debt because at the end of the day, the problem with debt is you have to repay it, right? Pakistan especially is a very special issue. Our household debt is close to nothing. As individuals, as householders, we just don't borrow.
We don't borrow.
We don't borrow.
Okay.
Right?
So that's good.
No.
That's not good. Because okay.
I'll tell you why. Yeah. Because debt it's like your diet.
Okay.
If you have too little, you get malnourished.
Okay.
And that's what happened 60, 70 years ago. Lesser developed countries like Pakistan were not borrowing.
Okay.
Right? And they couldn't develop their economies. But the problem is, once you start eating too much and too much of the wrong foods, you get all kinds of diseases, as we know. Heart disease, diabetes, overweight, and so on and so forth. So it's like your diet, you have to be very careful.
I like that analogy that it's like so you just got to have just the right amount of debt to be able to propel the GDP part जिसकी आप बात कर रहे हैं.
Right amount and right quality of debt.
Right quality as well. इस पाकिस्तान के अमाउंट और क्वालिटी कैसी है डेट की?
So, as I said, household debt is negligible.
Okay.
That's good in the sense that, you don't have to worry about repaying your debts. But, one big factor, the way that a lot of economies grew is through household debt. Why? Because it allowed people to take a stake in their home. If you have a developed mortgage market, people are more easily able to buy homes. Once they buy a home, they have a stake in the economy. They often reinvest that money into a small business and so on. So household debt, we need to grow, and especially on the mortgage market. Corporate debt now. You look at many of our neighboring countries, they've got global ambitions, right? You've got global brands. Why don't we have that? Because we have not scaled up.
Okay.
How do you scale up? By building factories, by building developments, by expanding your operations. How do you do that? A lot of it is funded by debt. Our corporate debt is also very small compared to GDP, less than 20%. Most countries have 60, 70, 80%. Countries in our zone, like, again, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. Our big problem is government debt. Neither do we tax enough, because our tax to GDP has been 9 to 10% for the past few years. Most countries, again, 15, 16, 18%. But the government spends too much compared to the tax take.
Mm-hmm.
So hence, because the tax take is low, the spending is high, how do you bridge that gap? Is by taking. So it's a government problem. The government has borrowed too much, and that is a cause of concern.
Okay. 3 things that you talked about: mortgage debt, corporate debt, government debt. Mortgage debt पे सवाल मेरा शायद ये है कि do we have the institutional framework around to enable, let's say, lenders like the banks to be able to go out in that direction with all guns blazing? Second, our monetary policy, are the interest rates conducive enough for corporates to come in, take those loans, expand the facilities, create that scale? And obviously वो जो तीसरी आपने गवर्नमेंट डेट की बात की उसमें तो वो टैक्सेशन पे जितनी बात की जाए, टैक्स नेट को बढ़ाने की, टैक्स बेस को बढ़ाने की. So again, 3 things: institutional framework, yes or no for mortgage debt, interest rates for corporate debt, and tax base for government debt. What's your take on these 3 aspects for these 3 debts?
So excellent question. So on the infrastructure side, there are 2, 3 critical things. One is that foreclosure. So a bank, obviously, when you lend money to a householder, you need the ability to foreclose on it, to repossess the house if the householder doesn't pay you back. That law we've been hearing has been approved and so on, but it hasn't come through. And even right now, it's very difficult for banks to foreclose on that, right?
Yeah,
so that's the first thing. The second thing that the government needs to do is work on the documentation side, because a lot of the kacha kaam kache parchi hoti hai, that kind of thing. That's true in a lot of the country.
Okay.
The registration mechanism needs to be developed.
Okay.
Now, moving on to the corporate debt. Now, you see, a few years ago, interest rates were 7-8%.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a cycle. Inflation is coming down. We expect rates to come down as well. At some stage, it'll make sense for corporates to invest. And by the way, I'm not pushing loans out the door and trying to act as a, sort of pusher of loans here. But every corporate in this country is holding back investments, right? Because high rates, because of policy uncertainty, and so on and so forth. It's probably the best time to invest.
It's the best time to invest?
Yes, because very few people are investing, so you get first mover advantage.
Okay.
Now, rates today are 21, 22%.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
They will probably come down. And once they start coming down, the infrastructure you've put up will start generating revenue. So
would you hazard a guess? When would they come down? Or do you see a trend coming in?
I see. Look, we are not a heavily inflation-prone country.
Okay.
Those countries are countries like Turkey and Egypt. I wouldn't even call Egypt. Turkey, Argentina. These are middle-income economies. Middle-income economies have a very special problem because they're trying to get to a high-income economy. They have relatively high wages compared to us. they want to protect those wages.
Yeah.
And so once inflation starts going up, you have, like in Argentina, you have something called wage indexation. So the wages go up automatically. They've seen 100% interest rates, 120% inflation in the past couple of years. So you have an automatic spiral where once inflation goes up, it stays up and it tends to spiral up. We don't have that problem.
Just put this into context. आपने very interesting बात की. Pakistan में, what was the peak inflation that we experienced right now?
38%.
38. At the same time, what's the peak inflation that countries like Argentina are experiencing?
Right now, in the recent past?
Yeah, in the recent past.
Because in the past, it's been well over 1,000%.
Well over 1,000%.
Right.
And what about Turkey?
Turkey, well over 100%.
So when we, so how does that differ for a country like Pakistan? Because there was a massive uproar in the country about the high inflation rate that we have hit, which is, you're saying, in the 30s. But when you compare that to countries like Argentina and Turkey, so are those economies structured differently that they can weather that kind of inflation levels? And we are a less developed country, so हमारे लिए 30% भी बहुत ज़्यादा हो जाता है. Why is there this disparity?
Again, wherever you have high inflation, there's a pinch. And people will protest. Of course, they would protest in Turkey and Argentina as well and so on. But as I said, they have relatively high wages.
Yeah.
So they can cope with that.
Yeah.
Pakistan, because we already have very low wages, and a lot of the inflation was food inflation.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. All right.
So
it's not just the size of, it's also the quality of inflation and what the inflation is all about.
Exactly, yeah.
So food inflation is that what really hits
hurts
you at
us,
the end.
yes.
Okay.
Because we have a lot of very low income wage earners.
Okay. All right. ठीक है. और आपने जो गवर्नमेंट डेट की बात की थी, उसके अंदर जो है ऑब्वियसली हम टैक्स बेस की बात करते हैं. अभी वो there were also some rumblings about reforming how the tax structure is. What's your take on that? On all the discussion that's going around taxation, taxnet, FBR के reforms की बात की जा रही है, and so on and so forth. How do you see that panning out in the future?
Right. Well, how would I like
a lot of this, yeah, how would you like to maybe? Well, a lot of this is like crystal ball gazing, right?
Yeah.
Some of it. So, yeah, please.
Again, what needs to be done clearly is no country in the world survives on such a small tax base.
Okay.
And if you keep spending and not taxing people, then you're heading for a very difficult situation.
Okay.
So what we really need is to widen the tax base. It's all out there in the open. We need to tax the untaxed, retail sector, perhaps even agri sector. I mean, other countries tax the agri sectors as well. And it doesn't need to be a very high tax. And the other, obviously, is many other businesses don't pay the share of taxes. So I think a comprehensive plan needs to be put in place.
So do you believe that a step change in our fiscal and monetary policies is in the offing, or is it already begun?
I think the authorities recognize that this can't go on.
Okay. So we just having a conversation before the podcast began, and you spoke of a certain concept called socialization of market and economies. Can you explain what this means, and how does it impact an emerging economy like Pakistan? This socialization of markets and economies.
Right. So this is more, I would say, a developed country phenomenon.
Yeah.
And what's happened in the US, especially since 2008, what happened is you had a very sharp fall in the economy, right? You had a housing bubble which burst. Growth rates just plummeted, usually negative for several quarters. The government stepped in, printed a lot of money, and spent a lot of money trying to bail out the economies. And since then, this is now 15, 16 years ago, every time there's a dip, you see the same story playing out. A lot of money being printed, a lot of spending from the government to bail out the economies. So basically, what happens is that the economy, when it takes a downturn now, you have Big Brother stepping in and trying to save markets. Now, the problem or the key factor there is that what they bail out are the financial markets. Because the one thing that, say, the US Central Bank, European central banks don't want is for financial markets to crash.
Okay.
So they will inject money, buying up bonds, buying up financial assets to make sure that those assets remain, buoyed and they remain in demand.
Okay.
I'm talking bonds, I'm talking commodities, I'm talking stocks. Now, who owns financial assets typically in the West, especially? And all over the world. It's the wealthy and the well-off.
Yeah.
So this is not the kind of socialization we saw or we heard of when we were growing up. The socialization for the poor.
Yeah.
This is socialization of the rich, of the well-off, the middle class, the elderly, the middle-aged people who have financial assets. They're being bailed out. A lot of young people coming through in the US and even China and in Europe either don't have jobs or not the kind of jobs they expected. They don't have financial assets, right?
Yeah.
So they're not being bailed out. So this is now becoming, I think these countries really have to have a rethink in how they're spending their money, because they are creating now a generation coming through who don't have the same opportunities as their parents and grandparents, don't have the same access to capital, and they're creating a huge problem for themselves.
Okay. ऋषभ, गुज़श्ता 2 साल से I think it's fair to say that the conversation around Pakistan's financial situation and Pakistan's economic situation has gone beyond the realm of experts such as yourself or even the politicians. It has actually now seeped down to the street level. आप किसी से ही बात करें सड़क पे, वो आपको बताएगा कि जी पाकिस्तान में इन्फ्लेशन है, पाकिस्तान में IMF के लोन हमें चाहिए होंगे, and the list goes on. Literally right now, there's a cacophony of opinions when it comes to Pakistan's economy, from privatization of SOEs to the circular debt and so on and so forth. The current finance minister, who's our ex-boss, also has laid out some very clear roadmap as to how he sees the economy going on. If I were to ask you, policy prescriptions की तो कमी नहीं है, आप कहाँ से शुरू करेंगे आज से कि यार ये 3 चीज़ों तक कम से कम हमें शुरू कर देनी चाहिए to begin with? Maybe they already begun, but what are those 3 things that you would say from your perspective, at least we should begin now? बाकी चीज़ें तो होती रहेंगी अपने साथ-साथ. What would that be?
जो आपने शुरू में जिक्र किया था उसके बारे में मैं कुछ बोलूँगा. So I think it's a great thing that people are talking about the economy.
Okay.
And because that way they'll try to understand, that they'll see what's going on, that they have some opinions, and it's okay to have different opinions. Where I feel the authorities and the government need to step in is explain that narrative, what's going on.
Okay.
Let's not keep things hidden.
Yeah.
Because then people start mistrusting you, people start wondering what's going on. I'll give you an example of Argentina. They elected a president last year, Milei.
Who's a radical?
Who is very much a radical.
Very radical, yeah.
And he came in with
He's talking about dollarizing the entire economy, apparently.
Yes,
that's what I've heard.
Yes.
Read somewhere, actually.
Exactly. He said he'll burn down the central bank.
That's what I heard.
He said the authorities in the past have really wrecked the economy.
Yeah.
They spent too much on the wrong things. So he's come in with a hatchet and cut a lot of spending, which is hurting. But what he has done is every step along the way, he's explained why he's doing it. He's saying we can't afford these fancy projects and these extra expenses and too many government departments and so on and so forth. He's talking about having to maintain control over inflation. You can't survive with 100% plus inflation for how long?
Yeah.
Right? It'll just hollow out all your industrial capacity. So early days now, but inflation has come down. Government expenses, they're running a budget surplus. As I said, it's early days yet, but things can be done to put the economy on the right track, and let's hope he succeeds.
Risha, let me just conclude this podcast by asking you one last question. When it comes to Pakistan's economy, are you a glass half full person or a glass half empty person?
Okay, good question. So I would say glass half full.
Okay.
I'm cautiously optimistic.
Cautious, okay.
Look, I think a lot of the problems are not insurmountable.
Okay.
We have, yes, a lot of debt, external debt, but very little of that is Eurobonds and commercial debt. A lot of it is multilateral, bilateral, and so on. So on the debt side, although it's large, it's manageable. We should be able to, if we offer a coherent plan out of this situation, then we should be able to get the support of the multilaterals and bilaterals and so on. We have huge untapped potential. We talk about the mineral sector has hardly been touched. Our industrial and manufacturing sector has hardly stepped up. There are some winners there, but there are huge parts of industry where we haven't developed. And with the right approach, I don't see why we can't develop that industry. And we don't have to be world beaters in a certain industry day one.
Okay.
Let's develop something domestically rather than importing them, and then eventually develop into exporters and so on and so forth. And at the same time, develop our export industry as well. So we can work on multiple fronts. And, what gives me cause for optimism is you look at several countries around the world. You look at the Czech Republic, which was a communist nation, and in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
It's developed back into a very strong and very industrialized country. Indonesia and Vietnam are great examples as well. Vietnam had fewer exports than us 25, 30 years ago. Now they have close to 7-8 times our exports.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Right?
Okay.
So it can be done.
Okay.
We just have to stay focused.
Stay the course.
Yeah.
Thank you, Risha. On this upbeat assessment, I'd bring to close the HBL Inspire podcast on global markets outlook and local impact. Thank you, Risha, for joining us in the studio, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in.